Today's responsorial psalm is part of a longer psalm whose theme is God's compassion, mercy, and care for us and for the whole of humanity. As with all the psalms, this language is the language of poetry. It describes people of faith as those who live in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty. Such people know that their lives unfold in the presence of God, that He is with them and will guide them and protect them from what might harm or overwhelm them. He is their refuge, their fortress, the one in whom they trust. These verses were chosen for today's Mass primarily because of their obvious relationship to themes in today's reading from the book of Genesis. Jacob, the younger son of Isaac and Rebekah, has just cheated his older brother Esau out of his father's blessing. To escape his brother's anger and to find a wife among his relatives, he has set out for Haran, a place in which Abraham's family has settled. The reading describes a dream that Jacob has and that speaks to concerns and worries that he must have felt at that moment. Worries about what he had done and about his meaning for the promises that have been made by God to Abraham and to his own father, Isaac. The ladder in the dream, a ladder that reaches from earth to heaven, seems to affirm that as much as the divine world is other than our world, the two worlds are not unconnected. The word for angel in Hebrew means someone who is sent. Angels are messengers and go-betweens, creatures that connect the two worlds. They symbolize and mediate God's continuing presence in our world. As frightening and awe-inspiring as the dream is, it cannot but be assuring for Jacob. In spite of his sin, God, far from rejecting him, has accepted the fact that by receiving his father's blessing, he, Jacob, will now carry forward the covenant that God sealed with Abraham. God introduces himself in the dream as the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. He is a God of people, a God who is actively involved in human life. The promises he made to Abraham and Isaac are now transferred to Jacob. It is his offspring that will flourish and that will inherit the land. In him and in them, all the families of the earth will be blessed. The Lord's final words to Jacob in the dream are words of assurance. Know that I am with you, he says, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. The psalm echoes that assurance when it affirms of God, he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. In the Gospel, Matthew applies to Jesus a saying from the prophet Isaiah about a virgin bearing a son who is to be called Emmanuel. That is, God is with us. It's no exaggeration to suggest that the whole of Matthew's Gospel is intended to show how what is implicit in that name is fulfilled in Jesus, fulfilled in his teaching, and most dramatically in the healing, liberating, life-giving nature of his activity. The gospel miracles are signs, signs that God's power is present and at work in Jesus. It is by that power that he stills the waves and feeds the multitude, frees the possessed, and restores sight and hearing to the blind and the deaf. Today's gospel offers a twofold example of the divine power at work in Jesus. In the one case, to the benefit of a child who has recently died, and in the other, to that of a woman suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. In both incidents, faith plays a crucial role. Faith in Jesus, faith in his willingness and ability to do what is being asked of him. In spite of the ritual impurity caused by her condition, the woman dares to approach Jesus, seeking simply to touch his cloak. Although the touch by itself does not heal her, his word does. His word and her faith. So too with the leader of the synagogue. Although others laugh at and mock Jesus when he says that the child is not dead, but sleeping, the man is convinced that if Jesus would but lay his hands on the child, she will live. Once again, faith is rewarded. The child lives. The two incidents, individually taken together, reveal the divine power at work in Jesus, as well as in compassion and mercy. To those who reach out to him in faith and trust, he gives what they seek. Gospel stories like these are about more than the particular people and actions they describe. They affirm God's continuing care and concern for human life and encourage us to trust in him. God is with us to heal and guide us on that journey of life, which eventually will lead us back to him.
In maybe a strange way, today's gospel takes me back to my days as a high school religion teacher. Not because those teenage students were eager and really interested in learning religion. You could say it was not their favorite subject. But because from time to time there came the unexpected reaction from one or other of them. And today's reading turned out to be such an occasion. You heard the opening phrase, Jesus went about all the towns and villages. And that half of a sentence brought this particular comment from one of the students. People always seem to be going somewhere in the Bible. I'd never thought of that before, but he brought it up. Going somewhere. That was certainly true of Jesus himself. Now here, now there, up north in Galilee, down by the lake, out in a boat, up a mountain where he gave the Sermon on the Mount. Well, it's not really a mountain, it's more a high hill, the Mount of Beatitudes. And then think of the other descriptions of him up a mount. Mount Tabor, the Mount of the Transfiguration, the Sermon on the Mount, and finally the ascension into heaven from the Mount of Olives. No loudspeakers back then, no microphones, no turning up the volume from the control room in those days. A preacher had to gather the people around him and speak as loudly as he could. And linking these larger gatherings, we read of Jesus going about all the cities and villages, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing all kinds of diseases and illnesses. Along with being a teacher and a preacher, Jesus was also a healer. He drew large crowds to him out in the open. He spent his time out and about, here and there, up on the mountain, down by the lake. And he didn't just go to the local synagogues on Saturday. He sought people out day by day as he moved among them. And as he moved here and there, he remarked on how leaderless they seemed, how unemployed they were, how different seasons made a difference in their fairly monotonous lives. We hear about crowds who followed him, or hearing he was in town, went out to hear him for themselves. The crowds. For many of them, every day was a no-work day. The crowds. Jesus had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion for them. Maybe he recalled his own years in Nazareth as a teenager, giving Joseph a helping hand, earning enough money between them to enable his mother to buy enough food for all three of them, or perhaps buying enough ingredients to make and bake and cook at home. Well, harvest time gave employment, but Jesus remarked how few laborers there were. If you're idle, out of work, you get into a rut, and then those willing to work become few and far between. So back to that phrase from that student. People always seem to be going somewhere in the Bible. Yes, they had no permanent work to go to. They had time on their hands. Well, at least the men had. The daily cooking and housekeeping kept the women busy. And I can hear many of the women among you probably saying to yourselves, some things never change. But the daily trip to the well would have brought these women, these village women, together. And Jesus knew that if he waited long enough by the well of Sychar, one of the women of the village would come to draw water, and he could ask her to give him a drink of water, appreciated in those days. In his gospel, John has a whole chapter about the conversation between Jesus and that Samaritan woman, the woman at the well.
In the past few years, a number of parishes in Canada have adopted or sponsored 1, 2, or maybe even more refugee families. Every time I talk to a member of one of these families, there's a common expression that I always hear, and that is, I am so grateful for the gift of living a dream. As an immigrant myself, my family and I have been living our dream of living in Canada for more than 4 decades. Thanks to family and friends, our arrival in Canada was made easier with their help and always wonderful support. And the same has been and continues to be for our new friends from the eastern part of the world who also are making Canada their home. In today's first reading, we captured just half of the story of Joseph, who had been given up by his brothers for dead, and in the end, he saved his family from starvation. It was famine that forced Jacob's family to immigrate to Egypt, where they would grow into a great people. And in today's gospel, Matthew indicates that Jesus' earthly ministry was limited to Israel. However, after the resurrection, the disciples are commissioned to go into the world and make disciples of all people and nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And that is what they did, especially with Saints Peter and Paul, as we learn and hear in the Acts of the Apostles. And today, that calling is for me, for you, it's for all of us, to go out and make disciples of everyone we meet. You see, as much as I love Canada, my place of birth is still a very, very special place that I like to visit, even though I don't get there very often. Yet, when I go, it's wonderful to see how the people have developed over the years, and I look around and see they've actually grown a lot in where they are living. And I always forget that I too have grown and have also changed in the community that I live in today and love so much. When we think of it, all of us are on a journey on this earth, no matter what background, nationality, or status. We are all called to, like Joseph, to help feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And like Jesus, we are commanded to also to go into the world and make disciples of all peoples and nations. I share with you a quote regarding today's readings that I think sort of sums up very, very well. And the quote is, "Our religious and personal past conditions are thinking about faith and God." In other words, our religious and personal past conditions are thinking about faith and God. Our past can tell us a great deal about God's plan for our individual futures, end quote. So, from the sacraments of initiation, namely baptism, Holy Communion, and confirmation, we are all sent on a mission to proclaim who we are and make disciples, to make followers of people, followers of Jesus, those who we encounter, because we know that we are in this special journey, a journey to the kingdom of heaven. So why not? Those you encounter, invite them to join you on that journey to heaven. It could be a shorter journey here, it could be a longer journey on this earth. Only God knows for sure. But always extend that invitation so that our journey to heaven will be one accompanied with friends and one day in the presence of our Lord. And may you have a beautiful journey into the kingdom. Amen.
Cure, raise, cleanse, cast out, proclaim. Right at the opening of St. Mark's Gospel, the curing, the healing ministry of Jesus is made evident because one of his first public acts is to heal, to cure Simon Peter's mother-in-law. And we know so many of the stories of his healing, of his curing. One of the most beautiful is his healing of the blind man Bartimaeus, whom he finds in the mud on the road up from the Jordan. And Bartimaeus cries out and pleads with Jesus to heal him. Lord, that I may see. And of course, Jesus does heal and cure him. There was a widow. We know widows in the time of Jesus, today in so many ways too, where difficult for them to sustain and care for themselves. And her son died. That was the only real hope of sustenance and being able to take care of him. She was dead. Jesus came and touched the bier. He raised him up from the dead. The powerful story of his dear friend Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. There's nothing more eloquent as a story, I think, of healing than the 10 lepers he met on the road. He cured all 10 of them. Sadly, only one of them came back to give praise and thanks to God. But Jesus came and he approached. He was close to the lepers and he healed them. And demons, people with what we would call mental illness, were overwhelmed in his day and age. There's a place on the east side of the Sea of Galilee where the Gadarene swine were. And people came out of the tombs. They'd been locked up. They were lashing and hurting themselves. And Jesus drove the demonic spirits, drove the evil spirits out of them. And he cast out those spirits which were torturing and causing so much pain, not only to people around, but to the individuals themselves. And Jesus always did that curing, that healing, that casting out, that raising up from within inside himself. It's his own experiential knowledge that brings him to that. After all, he grew up in a small village where the evidence of people being sick was all around him. And therefore, the medicine would have been rather primitive by our standards, and so people needed to be healed and cured. There were certainly deaths which would have happened so very often. His own father, Joseph, died, and the fact of death would have struck him very, very powerfully, as it did his mother. Wasn't afraid to be close to lepers. I was privileged many years ago to visit one of Mother Teresa's hostels in Tanzania and Africa. And at this point, they hadn't really gotten control of the medication for lepers. And so off to the side, in a tiny bungalow, was a man who was a leper, badly deformed in his body. And there just wasn't the medical power and will, perhaps then, certainly in ancient times, to be able to do that and respond, and then to isolate the person because it was an infectious disease. And Jesus confronted demons all the time. They were present to him. Get away from me, Satan, be gone. The demonic, the evil spirit was constantly attacking the goodness of Jesus, constantly trying to bring him back, to put him on his own terms, and to reduce this marvelous power, this gift he had for proclaiming the gospel by curing, by cleansing, by casting up, and by raising people, not only physically from the dead, but the spirits, giving hope to the community around it. And the way he did it is extraordinary. He did it freely, gratuitously. He wasn't in the business, if you will, of making money from the powers he had. He was given these great gifts by God, and he bestowed them graciously, freely, to whoever came by and asked for and pleaded to him. And he wasn't touchy. What I mean by touchy means that when he presented or tried to do something, some people, like the rich young man, turned away from him. Jesus didn't explode. He didn't get hurt. He wasn't sensitive in that touchy way, saying, "Why don't you like me?" He accepted the fact that some people wouldn't listen to his words, didn't want to be in any way in association with him, and so he made the offer, and if they turned him down, in his freedom, in his own peace, he accepted that and went on. He also cared about everyone, but he knew he was a human being too, and therefore there was a limitation. Not everyone would want to hear his word. Not every house would accept him. But he knew that everybody was under God's care and love and protection, and so he entrusted those people to the hand and care of God. The gospel is so direct, so simple as it applies to you and me today. As best we can, those who are professionals cure people, and the rest of us can volunteer and help people. All of us can have a part in raising or being close to the dead. The great English Anglican woman doctor, Dr. Dame Cecily Saunders, is the one who started the modern hospice movement for those who are dying. I know people want to use their freedom to die. Well, there's another freedom that can be offered to them if you and I offer to assist the medical professionals. And people certainly need their spirits raised up. That's not only the job of psychiatrists and psychotherapists, and they do a great job, but you and I, in our encouragement of one another, in the work we do, the people we meet, we too can raise up people's spirits. One of the great demands of modern societies is the tremendous number of people who are suffering from mental illness, from demons. We've come a long way in graciously understanding and accepting, but always and everywhere. Again, not just psychiatrists and social workers. Everybody can have a part to play in responding to the needs of those who are possessed by whatever demons. It's not just a question of you and me doing something in the places where we need to be cured, where we need to be healed, where we need to be raised up. There too, Jesus is truly present. The gospel is so simple, so direct, so practical. It applies to you and me day in.
Yesterday, the 13th of July, was a very special day for me, the Feast of St. Henry, because on the 13th of July, 1943, I was ordained a priest. And at that time, I did not for the least think I would last this long or even live this long. It was an impossible task. And yet, Jacob in our first reading also had an impossible task. He had to go all the way to Egypt. He made a journey. And like Jacob, I too trust in the Lord. It is because he trusted in the Lord's call to him to come to Egypt that he went. He went in faith and he went in confidence. All of us are called to walk in a journey, to walk in love as Jesus walked in love, to walk in faith because Jesus invites us, and to walk without fear because of our faith in Jesus Christ. Strangely enough, our journeys need not take us like Jacob, also known as Israel, would have to go from Israel all the way to Egypt. Sometimes, just like in the gospel today, they are sent to just the surrounding countryside. And sometimes we may never move at all, but it is still a journey through life. For 2 months, I was in Spain doing a course in spirituality, the history, the background, the theology, how to preach retreats, and what were the techniques. And they were given by people who were not even born when I was ordained, and they were dynamic, they were fresh, they were exciting. And during that time, I learned so many things which I thought I knew before. One of the key factors was in prayer, always enter into prayer with a great sense of reverence. I knew that. But go with a definite prayer in your mind, in the Latin word id quod volo. What do I desire in this prayer? And that is just like when we go to the doctor. We just want to go to the doctor and say, give me some medication. Am I having breathing problems? Do I suffer from asthma? Do I have a broken leg? Do I have cancer? We have different treatments. And so I go to God with something that I desire. All our Jewish ancestors had that. Abraham and Sarah desired a son. Jacob desired to see his son Joseph before he died. Moses wanted to see the face of God. David wanted to build a temple, and the Lord said, no, that is what you desire, but I've got something better for you. Your son Solomon would build a temple, and Solomon asked for wisdom. In the New Testament, we have Simeon who says, Lord, you can let your servant depart in peace, for my eyes have seen what I desired, to see the Messiah. The same thing with Mary. She was called and invited, and she also answered. The one thing that we realize in prayer, in our journey in our life, that it is always an invitation. We don't just decide, you know what, I think I'm going to go on this journey. We will land on our face. God always invites us. It's not something to be grabbed or not something to be grasped. It's always given freely. But God always waits for a choice from us. What do you desire from me? And Jesus constantly asked that when he was doing the miracles. Here was Bartimaeus, who was blind, and Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? Did Bartimaeus actually have a desire? And the beauty about it is that when we ask for what we want and God invites us, God expects a response, a reply. Here I am, Lord, I come to do your will. And that is the beauty. When we answer positively to God's call with generosity, with hope, with optimism, there's always a deep sense of peace, a deep sense of joy. We might still have the cross, we might still have cancer and asthma and all the other problems and difficulties in our lives, but we have a sense of peace. As we journey through life, for most people, they fall in love, they get married, they have a child, and they thank God for the graces of the child. And then disillusionment seems to set in. Their diapers to be cleansed, their sleepless nights when the baby gets up, the baby is colicky, and then you say, Lord, when will this child ever grow up? And the child grows up into the terrible twos with a mind of its own and a stubbornness that even the parents did not have. And it's got in its legs ever-ready Duracell batteries that never seem to stop. And you say, when can we go on to teenage life? I need not explain what happens then. And then we say, I wish they were babies again. In our journey through life, God is always walking with us. And that is what we have a constant in our lives. We walk with love. We walk in faith. We walk without fear. Because God calls us on this journey, and God always walks with us. Take courage. Be not afraid. God bless you.
I have to tell you that when I read the gospel text today, one of the first things that came to my mind was the opening line of President Roosevelt's address, his inauguration address in 1933. Not that I was there, but I remember it. He said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Today, he confronted a people caught in the grips of the Great Depression. In today's gospel, Jesus said 3 times in that text, be not afraid. He tells his disciples not to fear those who can malign, disregard, or injure them. In the Gospel of Matthew, the entire 10th chapter is dedicated to Jesus' disciples who are sent on a mission and given guidelines on how to share in the mission of Jesus and the demands that it brings. The exhortation from Jesus to fear not comes at the conclusion of the missionary discourse as he commissions the disciples to proclaim the good news. He empowers them to believe in themselves as people loved by God. Father Scott Lewis exhorts them, he says, to not smother the power and the beauty of the message with fear. He goes on to say that the message of Jesus must be proclaimed openly and joyfully, regardless of the immediate consequences. Too many of us, I think, are silent in the face of violence and its many justifications. Too many of us are silent in the face of economic systems that deprive people of dignity and destroy both cultures and natural environment. We're reminded that men and women whose faith and love were greater than their fears are the ones who really changed history. You know, at the beginning of this month, there was a great gathering in Orlando, Florida, of Catholic leaders from all across the United States. The Joy of the Gospel in America was a gathering of some 3,000 leaders, selected by the bishops, but a real cross-section of people who are trying to respond to Pope Francis's call to a new era of evangelization and his dream of a missionary option for all pastoral activities and ministries. The invitation was really to examine today's concerns, challenges, and opportunities in the light of the mission of evangelization given each of us. This would be a most welcome initiative in Canada. It could be an occasion for bishops, lay leaders, religious, female and male, clergy, to come together to listen to each other and to acknowledge honestly and respectfully the challenges and difficulties that we confront in proclaiming the gospel in today's society. Be not afraid. As Sister Barbara Reed says, when we face our fears, voice them out loud to one another and surrender them to the one who has counted every hair on our head, we can diffuse their paralyzing power over us, and placing our full attention and trust in the one who cares for us and empowers us, we can experience a freedom far beyond fear. Jesus is not blind to the dangers and challenges of mission, and he doesn't want his disciples to be unprepared when they are confronted, but at the same time, not to be frightened off by the possible consequences. The message of Jesus is intended to make all of us free and to enable us to recognize the dignity and the infinite worth, our worth, in God's eyes. And just as God takes note of the tiniest of creatures, even the sparrows, even more will divine care encompass the lives of the disciples of Jesus. The Dominican Father Timothy Radcliffe commented, he said, humanity's history is like breathing. The vital moments of our history are always moments of humanity's lungs. God breathes into the lungs of Adam at the beginning, and then Christ breathes out his last breath at the climax of salvation, and then the Holy Spirit is breathed upon us at Pentecost. It is the Holy Spirit who is both the source and the author of mission. And to develop a new missionary option, the experience and the wisdom of the whole people of God is needed. In situations needed to be created where under the guidance of the Spirit, we come together as a church to reflect and discern on how we can be truly faithful to God in this day and age. You know, oftentimes when I'm asked to prepare a talk or a homily, I find myself searching for ideas. But when it's done with a group, there's usually a richness of ideas that acknowledge that the Word of God is addressed to each of us, not just the ordained. And each of us is called to share in the mission of breaking open the Word, the mission of evangelization. Each of us has been called to proclaim with boldness in our lives and in what we do and say the mystery of our God present to us. We should not face intimidation, but rather believe in ourselves as people loved by God. And remember, be not afraid